All righty, folks. It's been 3:30, at least for a few seconds. I was trying to get on to the 3:30 minute, but I want to just welcome everybody to the third of our three-part series of our network launch. So, Lindsay, you want to take us to the next slide? All right, my name is Bethany Fillers, and I'm the Director of Professional Learning for Rural Life. And I'm not going to introduce the whole team again, but on behalf of the team, we just, like I said, want to welcome everyone back for this last session of our three-part network launch. We hope everyone had a wonderful holiday season. We are so looking forward to continuing the work of this learning community in the coming semester. Couple things I did want to note there. Lindsay, if you'll head back one slide, is just a reminder that Lindsay Frigo is our session leader today from TNTP. Also rejoining us will be Dr. Jetta Donovan next time, back from having that sweet little baby. We're going to want to see pictures. And then also with us, Reagan Kelly, one of our partners from TNTP. So glad to see you. All right, next we'll take a look at these pretty faces, our rural life coaches. I know you all have been doing some work with them. With the other aspect of our grant, our personalized learning, some of you worked with them in our first cohort of schools, and some of you may be working with them now. And certainly you're used to seeing them in our breakout rooms that we do during the Strong Start network, but we are glad to have them with us. All right, and then really most importantly, there's you. Right, our network members. So looking forward to getting to know more about you this coming semester as we jump into this work together. All right, so next let's jump to our agenda. A few quick reminders. First, if you have not yet turned in your MOU, please try to do that, maybe even by the end of the week, maybe by tomorrow. It's important that we get all that documentation in so we can process it. So if you've not yet turned in your MOU, please send that to Brittany. Also, don't forget that our Strong Start Network website is really the hub of our network operations. It includes all of our meeting information, Zoom links, resources, all that good stuff. And as we continue to grow as a network, we'll start to add some other things there as well. All right, also today we're going to take just a moment to revisit our network goal and really why this Strong Start network was developed in the first place. I know we've all slept since December 10th when we talked about this last, but I think it's important for us to really think about what was intended when we developed the network and what we hope to accomplish as a learning community. So first and foremost, what you see there on the left is to offer members a community of support focused on what? Right, learning and implementing our newly adopted ELA materials. That's a big job in and of itself, let alone with COVID on top of it. So we really want to be a community of support for one another. And within that, we want to establish a regional community of lead learners. That's you all, right? Our network members. Made up of those who will champion the challenging and rewarding work of improving student outcomes in the middle school classroom, right? The middle school literacy classroom. And really that's what makes this unique. And it's kind of exciting, you know, in this effort to spread and scale the work of rural life and the creation of the Strong Start Network, we've already been noticed by some folks, including the Department of Ed, who's reached out and wants to learn from our work. And we might even have an opportunity to share with other implementation networks as well. So that's really exciting for us. All right, next, just wanted us to again think about what's our North Star, right? What do we hope to accomplish? How are we going to get there? I mean, of course, like I said, our goal is to improve student outcomes in that middle school literacy classroom. But, you know, that's a pretty broad aim. That's kind of like way out there. It's a little bit vague. And so we know that with improvement, you can improve what you can't measure. So over time, and like I mentioned last time, we're going to work to further define how we as a network are going to know that we're really making an improvement in our classrooms and in our schools as a whole. And what this really will look like, what will it sound like in our classrooms, and then how we can share what we're learning in our own individual classrooms and schools and our own context with each other and ultimately the region and maybe even across the state and across the nation. That would be even better. So as our network launch series wraps up, like I said, this is the third of our three-part series. We'll talk more today about the real work of this learning community as we begin to take and apply some of our early learnings back into our own classrooms and school. And here is where our journey begins. All right, so Lindsay, we can jump next to our key mindset. So what I think is important for us to remember is that a focus on continuous improvement is as much a frame of mind as it is a set of actions. And as we kick off this work together, we're going to keep the following mindsets at the forefront of our work. We're not going to dig into each of these in depth today. So Lindsay, you can kind of just click through them if you don't mind. But we are going to revisit them in upcoming sessions together. And they might look a little bit familiar. If you study some of those, some of that language ended up in your member commitment. So when you applied to be a part of the Strong Start Network, we use these mindsets to craft some of those member commitments that you reflected on. So we're going to be optimistic. We're going to have empathy for each other, our students, show some creative confidence, right? That's our approach to solving some big problems. We got to try maybe some things that haven't been tried before. We're going to make it real, meaning we're going to move past just this theory of how to do it and actually do it, like get into really doing it. Learn from failure, embrace some ambiguity, right? And we're just going to iterate. We're just going to keep trying stuff and circling back and reflecting. So I'm excited to dig into these a little bit more with you in the coming sessions together. All righty, at this point, I'll zip it because, wow, you listened to me for like a solid 7 minutes. And I'll transition over to Lindsay. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Bethany. I'm super excited to be here with you all today. Happy New Year. I hope you all had a wonderful end to 2020, which was an interesting year to say the least, but I'm happy to see you all today and excited to dive in. Just to remind us what we'll be doing together this year is we're going to be continuing to build a shared vision of excellent literacy instruction. We're going to dive deeply into your own curricular materials that you use in your own setting. And then we're going to engage in ongoing professional learning cycles. The great thing about today, which Bethany shared, is today we're really going to start digging into that professional learning cycle, the doing, which is really exciting. So we'll walk through that today, focusing specifically on kicking off that learning cycle. And we'll be focusing on the importance of text complexity, some things that we've hit on here or there throughout our previous 2 sessions. Identify how that text complexity relates to that Tennessee IPG, which we spent some time digging into over the last couple of sessions, and then actually planning for upcoming lessons that will maximize student engagement with complex text. So that will be the majority of what we will be doing today. And then we'll have some next steps of how we're actually going to implement this in our own buildings, and then come back together in February and share out what we've done and what we found. So we are going to kick off the learning cycle today, focusing on text complexity as a key component to strong literacy instruction. So before we dive in, let's think back to the work we did together in our last session. We spent a good amount of time talking about the Tennessee IPG. You all should have that in the back of your packet, so feel free to go back to that should it be helpful. And just as a reminder, we talked about this already, but the IPG is not an evaluation tool. It looks like it could be, but for our purposes, it's not an evaluation tool. Rather, it's a resource that we're going to continue to use. This is a resource for us to be able to build and have a common language around strong ELA instruction so that we can have a shared vision that we can use and learn together about. So what I want you to do now in the chat, I want you to type your response to this question you see on the slide here. How does the IPG exemplify research that we've talked about that you know around effective literacy instruction? I'm going to give you guys about a minute or two to type it in the chat, and then we're going to talk a little bit about it. So how does the IPG exemplify research around effective literacy instruction? You could type that in the chat. See discussion on text. the key shifts of literacy instruction we talked about, building knowledge. Aligns to the shifts again, yep, for sure. Focus on high quality text. Rigorous text, yep. Complex text is at the center of the lesson. Key actions for us as teachers to consider, 100%. Questioning, really effective questioning. Complex questioning, yep. Like I said, that higher level thinking. Yep. High quality text, yeah. So does anyone want to share out and kind of build on anything that they typed or that they saw a colleague type? Just to hear a little bit more about your thought process of when you're thinking and looking at the IPG, how you see that connection between effective literacy instruction. Anyone want to follow up? And I see a lot of really spot on comments in the chat, which I'm sure you're all seeing as well. High quality text that is worth the student's time. Interesting, I like that. I really like that. Denise, do you mind just sharing a little bit more? I don't mean to call you out, but I do like that because we've seen a lot of comments about high quality text, but I want to hear more about your rationale about that it's worth students' time. That's interesting, I like that. Do you mind sharing for a few seconds?
No, can you hear me?
Yep.
Is there a delay? Okay. Sometimes I have a delay. Anything that we're going to put in front of the students, any type of materials, activities that we're going to use needs to be worth the time that we're going to be spending, because as you know, time is our worst enemy. We don't have enough of it. We just need to be very purposeful, and the student also be engaged in it. If you don't have their time and it's purposeful.
That's great. Thanks so much. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I'm in agreement with a lot of what you guys are saying. Anyone else have one last thing to share out before we move on? We'll obviously have more time to talk about the IPG and to talk about what we know to be effective practices for strong literacy instruction. All right, well, I will keep us going. So the objectives for our time today is that by the end of the session, we'll all be able to describe the importance of text complexity in strong literacy instruction. We'll be able to identify how text complexity is related and actually comes out in that Tennessee IPG. And then we're going to plan for upcoming lessons that maximize student engagement with complex text. So we just talked about that student engagement piece is really important. So when we're planning, we want to keep students in mind to ensure that we're engaging them with the right parts of the text, that we're engaging them in ways that they are really able to have success grappling with the concepts that the text brings out. So this is kind of how our day is going to go together. We're going to start with understanding the importance of that text complexity. We're going to have that knowledge and vision building, which is that first piece kind of our learning cycle. We're going to apply. We're actually going to see it in practice by watching a video. We're going to plan for action. Think about what does this actually look like in our own school, in our own building. And then we're going to do the next steps, which is not actually going to happen today. That is what you're going to take back to your school and is going to be the basis for our time together in February. So as Bethany shared with us, this is really going to kick off our first learning cycle. So our learning cycles will follow this model, right? We're going to learn. So we're going to learn about the importance of text complexity and strong literacy instruction. Then we're going to apply. We're going to apply the learning with the actual materials that you use in your own schools, in your own classrooms. And then we're going to plan. We're going to create a plan for implementing new learning in your classroom. And then there will be the do piece where you will implement your plan in your own classroom, in your school. And like I said, we'll come back together next month to talk about how it went. So we're going to jump right into understanding the importance of text complexity. So, as you know, with our new curricular materials, texts are now basically complex for the most part, but it is our job to think about what we're going to do differently with these texts to ensure that students grapple with and unlock the meaning of these complex texts. It's easy to just say, okay, we have high quality materials, we're good. but that's actually not the case, right? We know we have potentially have good complex texts in front of us, but we really need to think about what we do with them. The IPG shows us what we want to think about when we're working with complex text, right? We want to identify the ways that the text is complex. We want to think about what tasks we're having students do to really grapple with that complexity, what questions we're asking, et cetera. So I want to just really drive home that yes, text complexity is, something we've all been talking about for years. And with our new curricular materials, we have stronger, more complex texts, but it doesn't just stop there. We need to really think critically about what we're doing with those complex texts. So as we started to touch on, you've probably now seen this several times already, as we start to touch on in December, in order to truly understand what those stumbling blocks will be in a text, we need to think about what actually makes the text complex, right? This is a really important piece for us to be doing before we dive into thinking about planning our lessons. So just as a reminder, I'm not going to go deep into it because we've talked about this before. There are 3 factors of complexity, right? There's that quantitative scale, that qualitative measure, and the professional judgment. Think about the task, the text, the students, and the tasks as well. Understanding how these texts are complex helps us look critically at the questions and tasks we are spending most of our time on, so that students can really truly understand it. You've seen this before. You also have these in your notes. Once again, these are our text complexity rubrics. You have these in your packets, like I said, and we may refer to them as we go throughout our session today and dive into different activities. So just know that that is there for you should you need it as a resource. Okay. So the qualitative measures rubric on the previous slide directs us to look at the text structures, language features, meaning, purpose, and knowledge demands that make a text more or less complex. We talked last time about those 2 different texts, right? Grapes of Wrath, and then I think it was Junie B. Jones, right? And technically they're the same lexile level, but we know that qualitatively they are completely different. And because of the complexity level, they're appropriate for different groups or ages of students. So another way I like to think about text complexity or qualitative complexity are those moments as I have as an adult when I'm reading, right? Sometimes I'm reading, I'm sure you all have these moments as well. You sort of stop in your tracks, right? You're reading a text and you realize that somewhere along the way, you got lost in a sentence and you need to reread it, right? So that is one for text structures and language features. Or maybe you're reading and you think to yourself, oh, I see what the author did here. They set this up from the beginning and now it's playing out right here in this part of the story. Or, wow, I definitely don't have enough knowledge about this topic for it to mean anything to me. So I need to learn more about whatever the topic may be. Maybe it's Russian Tsar history. Before I can even get into this, I need to really make sure I have enough of that background knowledge. These are all reactions that you might regularly have in your own reading life. And this is exactly what we are trying to assess in the text our students are reading. So there's so much connection between us as fluent adult readers and what we want to think about when we're putting a text in front of our students, right? If you have a text that is not qualitatively complex in one of these ways, is it even worth that literary analysis? Is it worth spending time with your students on this? When you think about the standards at each grade level that you're teaching, how will the students be able to analyze word choice or meaning, tone, author's purpose if the text isn't actually rich enough to allow for that to happen? So that's really what qualitative complexity is. You need to think about all these different characteristics and you need to make sure that it's actually worthwhile and there's enough there for them to really analyze. So what we're going to do now, you know what? I'm gonna skip that. We're gonna go to the next slide because I want to dive into some of the doing. So like I said, understanding what makes a text complex and where students will struggle is the key aspect, usually one of the first aspects of your planning, right? So when you're analyzing the complexity of a text, you should do the following. So we're going to focus first, we're going to go through all of these steps today together, but right now we're just going to focus on those first two. So first, you're going to read the text and pay close attention to its complexity. And you also have to look at the task and reader considerations. You know your students. Think about where your group of students may struggle most in this text. And then you're going to look at the analysis of complexity that the publisher has provided. From my understanding, I believe Pearson and Amplify have done this. And then if they don't have it, you can kind of go through the process looking at the rubrics as well. So what we're going to do now is we are going to think back to the text that we read for our pre-work. Dark they were and golden-eyed. I know this is familiar to some of you. Coaches, I know this is very familiar to you. We dove deep into this together a few months ago. So we've already read the text, which is that first step, right? Now we're going to look at this complexity that the publisher gives us. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to look at this, okay? And then we're going to come back together and think about what we're noticing about the complexity that the publisher gives us based on what you know, having read the text already. So I'm going to give you probably just about 1 minute to review this, and then we're going to talk about it. So you can keep looking at this if you need more time. But I want you to think about, based on what you read, are there areas that will be complex for your students or students that you know that the publisher didn't identify? You could type some ideas in the chat box. You can also just share out. So the publisher here gives us the text complexity rubric, but based on knowing your own students, is there something that they didn't identify that you think will be really important for your planning? You could type some stuff in the chat and also share out should you want to. I'd actually love to hear from anyone. So once again, is there something that they missed, that they didn't identify, that you thought is important based on the complexity of this text, knowing your students? And if not, what are your thoughts about how they identified the complexity of this text?
I would hope that they, again, and I'm just wondering, I'm thinking out loud here, some people might look, depending on their class or depending on one of their classes, and think, oh, my kids aren't going to be able to read this Lexile level, for example. But I would want to make sure that if I was looking within, and I'm assuming this is Pearson, that there could be some accessibility components too that would play into that don't necessarily have to do with the text itself, but the access to the text, right? Is that kind of, so we would kind of take that concern off the table, in other words, because they're going to have access to it digitally, more than likely.
And I see someone talked about the similes and literary devices that could have been added in here too. Since those come up to the knowledge demands and meaning throughout the text. Anything else? I know we all read it, so I'm sure there are things that you're thinking about, either that the publisher definitely hit on, or that things that you think that they did not hit on that you would want to think about. Basic info about planet Mars. Yeah, potentially. Figurative language is a challenge for a lot of the students. Yeah, so I think it's really important to look at this closely, right? Just because the publisher put it out does not mean it's perfect for your own students, right? They're thinking generally speaking. It is really important for you to think specifically about the students that you're working with. Is there something they're missing, or are they spot on? And they may be spot on, or there may be some things that you want to think about a little bit deeper, knowing your own students. I see consider assumptions or misconceptions students may have. Yep. Some of these darker themes Tracy shared with us. So these are all really important things to think about when we're trying to identify how complex a text is and where our own students will struggle. So I'm going to go back to these steps, right? we read the text, we paid close attention to its complexity. The publisher in this case had an analysis, we looked at it, we think that there may be a few things that they might be missing, but overall it is pretty strong. The next steps would be to analyze the questions provided to identify how they got at that complexity that was identified or that you identified as potential problems or struggles for your own students. You may need to tweak questions or supplement them slightly to really get at the complexity that your students may be struggling with. And then you always want to craft an exemplar student response. This is super crucial so that you're thinking ahead of time, what do you want students to get out of this? What would an exemplar response have that hit on all of the things that you're hoping students grasp? And that's really, really helpful, because then when you're actually reading the text with students or asking them questions, you know exactly what you're looking for. And you may even have some follow-up questions to get them to really grappling with it at a level you're hoping. Before we kind of go through these next 3 steps, which you will have an opportunity to do, I want to talk a little bit more about questions, specifically text-dependent questions. So here is a nice little graphic. So like we said, analyzing questions provided to identify how they got at specific complexity is really important. So after looking closely at the complexity demands, we need to look closely at the questions outlined. The publisher gives us questions for each text in specific areas that try to get at these complexity demands. We want to make sure that these questions are text dependent and are truly attending to those qualitative features, including meaning and purpose, language, structure, knowledge demands, that we talked about earlier. Strong questions enhance text comprehension, right? Because by having really strong questions, you're specifically targeting those qualitative complexity, the qualitative complexity of those texts and the really complex parts of the text. So it's really, really important to think about the questions we're asking, because it will enhance the comprehension that our students are having as they're reading the text. So first, it's important to note that questions should be text dependent, right? Meaning that students must pay attention or go back to the text at hand and draw evidence from the text. That's also linked back to those shifts we've talked about lots of different times, right? Using evidence from the text. So be on the lookout, though, for questions that are about the text or the topic at hand, but don't actually require students to wrestle with the text, because that often happens as well. Not that those questions are, you'd have to skip all of them. Some of them might be useful, but for the most part, we want to make sure and look closely at the questions to ensure that they are text dependent. Not going to dive into it today, but I'm sure you've also heard about text specific questions, right? There's text dependent questions and text specific questions. And this is something we're going to dig deeper into in one of our upcoming sessions to really think about the differences between text dependent and text specific questions. So I want you to take a minute to just look at these non-text dependent questions and the text dependent questions. If you're noticing anything, feel free to type it in the chat. And then I'm going to just talk through what were the big differences we're seeing in these type of questions are. Yes, students don't even have to read the text to answer the non-text dependent questions. Yep, 100%. They don't even have to read the text. They could potentially answer it having read 0 lines of the text. That non-text dependence gives students a choice, and they don't have to read. Some are asking your own opinion. They rely on students' feelings about something. How you feel, your own opinion. Yeah, so you're not actually knowing if your students are actually understanding what they read, because many of these questions can be answered without even have read the text. So that is really really important to think about. So let's consider these questions from Dark They Were and Golden Eyed. I want you to take a few minutes to read these questions and compare to the complexity that the publisher gave us. Then in the Padlet, which we're going to drop in the chat, the link to the Padlet, I want you to think about, how do these questions get at the complexity of the text? So based on these questions that we're seeing here, how do they get to the complexity of the text as the complexity is laid out by what you know, by what the publisher shared with us? So if we can drop the Padlet in the chat, we could start typing as we, after we read these questions, and start to think about how these questions get at the complexity of the text. And then we'll come back together and share kind of what your findings are. Share out what you noticed, or what you noticed your colleagues write. John, are you able to drop that in the chat? If not, I probably can. Everyone should be able to access that now. What you notice about how these questions get at the complexity of the text. Dark They Were and Golden Eyed.
Can you take the screen back to the questions?
Yep.
Thank you.
Sorry, guys. Give us 2 minutes to type in the Padlet, and then we'll come back together. So I'd love to hear from you guys about what you noticed. How do these questions get at the complexity of the text? You just share out some things you noticed that other people wrote or that you wrote yourself.
So something I saw in particular was that this not only asked them to reflect on what the text said and asked them to bring relevant evidence and to support their inferences, but it also goes so far as to get into like author's intent. Like, why did Ray Bradbury make this decision? And I love to talk about that with my 8th graders, because I think there's not much deeper thinking than thinking about your own thinking and someone else's thinking. And that really just gets into it, you know?
Yeah, I love that. Any other thoughts or takeaways? And I agree, Catherine, these teachers are very smart. I love these comments.
There's also an opportunity to talk about sentence structure and when the author has characters speaking and how the text goes fast and slow and moves from one part of the plot to the other. So they're great questions in and of themselves, but they also lead to kind of supporting more deeply this concept of structure and why when characters speak quickly or say certain things, how that enhances the meaning or understanding of what's getting ready to happen or what's happening.
I see that they require analyzation and they're all text dependent. Yes, no students can answer these questions without having read the text. Author's craft, demonstrate understanding of they have to demonstrate an understanding of their text, the text, different levels of meaning, show evidence of their knowledge and understanding of the text.
Lindsay, can I ask a question there? And
Yeah.
I may be being kind of nitpicky, but I liked how number 4 explicitly called on them to look at clues that led, I can't remember the exact wording, but I didn't feel like it was
clues to the, the
I didn't know if I saw that same explicitness in the first 3 questions where it really said use evidence from the text. I mean, I know there's lots of ways to word that, but I did like how that last one specifically said what clues led you to think X, Y, or Z.
Yep, using that explicit evidence from the text, right? The other ones, definitely you needed to understand the text and have read the text to answer them. But number 4 is asking you to really identify and pull pieces out from the text. Yeah, I noticed that too, Bethany. Any other thoughts? Guys, thank you so much for your really good thoughts and engagement on the Padlet. Any other things you want to share out to the group? All right, then I'm gonna keep us moving, and we're gonna have opportunities to think deeper about some other questions and some questions that come out of in our own text that we will be working on with our students. So now we're going to practice. So we are going to go through these steps at a high level using the text that we all used for pre-work or read for pre-work, Dark They Were and Golden Eyed, right? So we read the text, look at the text complexity, analyze the questions, which we just did, tweak the questions, which we have not done yet, and craft exemplar student responses. So what we're going to do now is we are going to get put into groups. We're going to have breakout groups, random pairings, okay? And together, what we're going to do is talk about the questions, either those 4 questions that we just looked at or other questions that your group decides you want to look at. Think about where we might need to tweak them or supplement them. And then I want you to choose one of the questions and then together craft an exemplar student response. What would you want students to include in their answer to this question? This is all going to be done in Google Docs, which I will drop myself or someone else will drop in the chat. So you will need to choose one person to type for your group. I labeled it by breakout room number. So hopefully we'll be able to see what breakout room we're in so you guys could choose which row to type in. Any questions before John sends us to breakout rooms and before I put this Google Doc up on the screen? So remember, you're going through these last 2 steps together. Tweak the questions and supplement as needed. craft an exemplar student response to the questions that are text dependent. I am going to link the wrong one. Give me 1 second. I'm going to link this for everybody. And then John, whenever you're ready, you can get everyone into breakout rooms. Oh, it's already linked there. Thank you, Sean.
Tracy, Lindsay, let me do one thing.
Yeah.
I've named the group after the coach, so let me just rename them.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
Just rename them real quick.
Perfect. And then as soon as you guys get in, just decide which one of your team members will do the typing. And then we'll come back together in about, let's say 10 minutes at around 20 after the hour. And we'll talk through what we noticed, what we shared, what we tweaked, and what we were hoping to hear from students when we asked these questions.
And Lindsay, just to clarify, this was our pre-session, our pre-work reading. So this reading is not included in the session materials. It's part of that other packet.
Yes, I apologize. I just didn't want to overwhelm you guys with 900 pages of things. Yes. And you know, if it's easier to just look at those questions specifically that we just talked about, you can do that as well. So you don't even have to access the text if it's not easily accessible for you.
I'll drop it again in the chat for folks.
Awesome. Thanks, Bethany. Looks like everyone's back. I know I popped into, I think, every room. Amazing discussion. And I see that I heard most of you already start to think about that exemplar response. I know that we didn't get to type everything out, which is completely fine. But I'd love to hear from you, if you want to share out about like what you noticed and how you might have tweaked the questions, and then what it made you think about in terms of student response, but then also how that process was for you and why you think that process is a really helpful and crucial piece when planning lessons around complex text for your students. So I'd love to really hear your reflections on that more so, why this process is so important and how you found it and how it was or was not helpful for you, or what pieces you felt were really helpful.
And when you say process, Lindsay, do you mean the process of crafting an exemplar response?
Yes, I think the process of thinking critically about the questions and then also thinking critically about then crafting that response for the student. So I think it's two-part. So I'd love to hear your reflections on that. And maybe it's something that you do already, which is awesome, and love to hear like how it has been really helpful to you, assuming it has.
One of the things that our group talked about was with our question about the repetition. We talked about, it was a conclusion question. We went back to the text and there were a couple of other questions prior to that that led to that question. And so it just kind of highlighted for us that it was important. It was really important to us that they had those scaffolded questions prior to that really difficult question. And the other thing is that they actually had to do something to the text. They had to annotate it in order to find the things so that you as a teacher, if you're walking around looking to see that your students understand what you're asking them to find, you can see that they have found it, and then you can build on that. So that was important to us.
I'd love to hear about the process of, you know, I think it's great that to look at the other questions, right? It's hard when you're just pulling out 4 questions when there's tons, but to really see how they're scaffolding and getting at the complexity. But I'd love to hear from you guys about the process of starting to either talk or actually draft what the exemplar response is and what that process was like for you and why you think it is probably super crucial when you continue to do this on your own for your own students.
Like, would you say it was easy? Was it kind of painful? Was it, talk a little bit about the process.
I think for me, since nobody else is talking, I think part of it is I believe the questions, you know, some kids aren't going to obviously notice this change at all when they read it. Well, the one we were working on talks about the why he suddenly starts agreeing and the repetition of the words. And I think part of that is the questions as we ask them, to me, on a level I was comprehending myself, like going through the steps of, oh, let's look at this change specifically. It helped me, you know, as we questioned, to actually comprehend what I just read. So I know that sounds simple, but I'm trying to say, like, some kids are going to read that and go, oh, that's what happened. And I think the question guides not just, you know, deeper thinking, but those kids who might have been lost, when we ask that question, they're like, oh, okay, that's why it makes, you know, that's why it's important. I noticed that, but I didn't know that's why it's important. I didn't really understand what it meant. And I think the comprehension element, obviously, they understood there's a conversation going on. He suddenly changes his mind, but focusing on the words and how we got there helps them to see craft along with their comprehension.
I think the other thing in thinking about, you know, crafting a student exemplar or thinking about a student exemplar is just that idea of you've got to know what you want to expect from the student before you lay it out there to the student, because otherwise, you know, you're almost willing to accept whatever they bring to you. You know, you've got to set out that golden expectation. And then as you're thinking about, you know, here's where I want the student to be, you can almost begin to think about, but I know my students well enough to know they're probably going to get to here. So what are other things I can do to scaffold them on up? And as you think about those exemplars, those are kind of the golden target for you to reach for, and to know, well, it's not okay for me to stop and accept this mediocre student answer, because that's not where I want them to be. And so it makes you a little bit more thoughtful about what you're willing to take from students, because you've spent the time and thought about, this is where I want them to be. And then you've also thought, you know, about what they might get hung up on before they get to there. So I think that that's an important thing to consider when you're thinking about student exemplars.
Yeah, I love that, Leanne. I think that it's easy to just accept certain, like, almost just right answers from students if you're not actually super clear with what your non-negotiables are, right? As teachers, we're always like, yeah, that's pretty good. That's good enough. But it can't be good enough. We have to know exactly what we want from our students. And you're right. Think about how we need to scaffold questions to get them there, knowing our students. So I think that is key and spot on. I really appreciate all your reflections. We're going to have more time to dive into this in a little bit. And so we could talk more in a little while, but I do want to keep going so we can get to actually using some of our own materials and looking at our own text that we will be using with our students. So I'm going to move us along. Thank you guys so much for your participation, and the thoughtful discussion was fabulous. So I really appreciate that. Okay, so we did this. Okay, so we can't talk about all this without thinking about our tool that shows us what some exemplary pieces of literacy instruction are, the IPG. So what I want us to do now, as a reminder, this has been adopted across Tennessee, and it outlines the instructional practices that we want to see. So let's think about text complexity specifically. I want you to take the next 3 minutes to review the IPG. It's in the back of your notes. And then you could review, you can annotate, make any notes that you want. And I want you to identify where text complexity shows up in the IPG, okay? And then in about 3 minutes, we'll come back together, and I want you to share where you saw that it actually lives in this document. Where do we see examples of text complexity? If you want to type anything in the chat, don't type it yet. Wait till I give you the cue so that everyone has time to process and annotate and think. So we'll come back together in 3 minutes. So feel free to get going, annotate, take whatever notes you need. So we're looking for text complexity in the IPG. All right, you can still look through and annotate, but if you guys want to start dropping in the chat where you see this come out, you could type in the core action, the indicators, and then we'll see kind of if we're noticing the same things. Core action 1, B and C, core action 2A. Question 1, B and C, question 2, A, B, C. Yep, I see a lot of similarities, which is awesome. Can anyone talk about specifically the indicators, share out the indicators you saw in core action 1 and why you chose those in terms of hitting on text complexity? I see a lot of people hit on exactly the same ones that I hit on, so I'd love to hear your thought process for specifically core action 1, which is high quality text at the center of instruction. Okay, how about someone who chose core action 1B? The anchor text is at or above the complexity level expected from the grade level. Would love to hear from you why you chose that.
So I chose both B and C, specifically because, I mean, okay, on a super, super obvious surface level, it says
Yes.
complexity of text is important. So
yep.
Ding, 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 winner. But also, I liked especially the wording in C about providing meaningful information in the service of building knowledge. Like, it's like, I want to give you a text that's going to like feed your brain and not just be another text that's comparable to everything else you've ever read in your educational career so far. So I thought that was a good one as well.
Love that. Thank you. And what about core action 2? So I see some people wrote a few of the indicators. Some people said maybe all of them. Would love to hear from 1 or 2 people around what you chose for core action 2 and why.
I specifically looked at core action 2 and mentioned it because when you look at that summary, it says, obviously you're pulling questioning, but it's to reflect the depth of the textual analysis. And I think when you're looking at the complexity, that kind of alludes to the depth. You're not just at surface and, you know, what the words are saying, but, you know, especially in this case with the character, you know, look at the character's development over time as well. And, you know, even their depth, and are they a complex character, or is it, you know, so I think it really serves a lot of purposes.
Great. Any other thoughts around core action 2? Any other thoughts? Bethany, I saw that you said maybe all 4. Would love to hear from you, if you don't mind, about choose one of them. Maybe B, because I haven't seen B as much. I'm sorry. Yeah, I've seen B a few times, but I'd love to hear from you specifically why you thought B.
In core action 2 or 3?
Core action 2. Sorry, guys.
Let's see. Questions and tasks require students to use evidence from the text to demonstrate understanding and to support their ideas about the text. These ideas are expressed through written and or oral responses. I mean, the fact that it's, you know, asking students, that's one of our shifts, right? Literacy shifts, to use evidence from the text, and not just in superficial ways, but for what purpose? To demonstrate understanding, and not just, you know, generally speaking, but orally and in writing, so that they can do both. And I kind of want to echo what Christy Snyder said. Test complexity is the foundation of the entire IPG. That stood out to me too, as I reflected over these, all these indicators.
Yeah. So, I mean, and we didn't really talk about core action 3 because, you know, it talks more about student engagement and what we're doing to engage students. So, yes, I agree that the big core actions that we're focusing on here with text complexity are core action 1 and 2. And I think you're all spot on in terms of how they lead to getting at really getting at the meaning behind the complex text. So I think that this is just a really good tool to always look back at, think about what you're focusing on, what in an ideal world you should be focusing on to really have that strong instruction. But this is just a really great resource that we're going to keep coming back to throughout our learning together, because it is really it really has a lot of benefits to look. So I'm going to keep us moving in terms of talking a little bit more about the IPG. I want to remind you that even though we focus really closely on these 2 areas today, there are 4 areas in the IPG, right? There's that culture of learning piece, which we know is really kind of like the basis of it all, right? If students are not engaged and like are just, it's chaotic, it's likely that there's not any good learning happening. So that's something really important to think about. So that there's that culture of learning where all students engaged in the work of the lesson from start to finish. There's that high quality text piece. Was there a strong text at the center of instruction? And if you say no to this, the rest of it is kind of null and void, right? If you're not having a strong text, then it doesn't even matter what questions and tasks you're having students do or answer, right? So then there's the questions and tasks piece. Did the teacher pose questions that deepen students' understanding of the text, requiring grade level analysis? And then that student ownership piece. Were students responsible for developing their thinking, analyzing the text, and synthesizing knowledge? So this is really important. And like I said, we're focusing really closely on that high quality text and the questions and tasks today, but we'll dive in deeper to student ownership and even talk a little bit about culture of learning too, as we progress in our time together. So now we're going to have an opportunity to kind of see some of this in practice. And bear with me, I just want to make sure that as I share this video, that you're able to hear it. So we're going to I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to be looking for in this video, and then give me a second to set it up. So we're going to be watching a video of a virtual synchronous instruction, something that you all are probably very familiar with in the past 9 months. Virtual synchronous, so meaning everyone is on live together on the computer, everyone in the class. So I want you to consider the evidence that you saw in the IPG, specifically on core action 1 and 2, and plus all of the learning we did today in terms of what is really strong instruction around text complexity. And these are the questions that I want you to think about. How does this video exemplify the planning process, best practices for planning for using complex text that we talked about today? And as you're listening, I want you to write down any questions you hear her ask that you think are really strong, or just, however you think is helpful to take notes to really process what she's saying, what student responses are. Any questions before we dive into this? We're going to watch about 5 minutes of this video and then talk about what we saw. So give me a second to set us up. One second. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second. I'm going to get us all set up here. Press play. Give me 1 second, guys. Oh, there we go. Whew, got nervous for a second. Okay. Let me share that again. Let's make sure that you can hear my share screen, share sound. Here's our video. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear.
So what we're now going to do is answer question number 2. We're going to go back to the text and answer the following questions. What do you notice about the author's word choice and imagery? How do those choices impact the reader? I want you to focus on paragraphs 2, 4, and 7. Let me synthesize what I'm seeing. A majority of you talked about how his author's craft moves demonstrate how dangerous the conditions were. Yeah, what I'm noticing is that we all basically said very similar things. And John, I want to push us to come up with a different interpretation. So I'm going to highlight some text, And then I'm gonna ask you to Zoom chat me what you notice. All right, so in paragraph 2, Lariah highlighted that their knuckles were getting swollen. Their hands also started to have cuts. In paragraph 4, Lariah highlighted that the acid is eating their fingers off. Now, a piece of evidence that I don't think I saw anyone really highlight was in paragraph 7, where, take a look, sometimes the fertilizer man would fall into the vats. I'm gonna ask you to participate. What would happen once they would fall into the vats?
If they were to fall into the vats, they if they were to fall into the vats, they would get hurt, or they'll be fished out, right? And then they'll go back to work.
They would get fished out and then they would go back to work. Angel?
I wanted to respectfully disagree with you when you said that they would be fished out and would have to go back to work. No, sometimes when they fell in, they would get like stuck for a couple days because people would forget about them, and then they would get shipped out, and sometimes people would end up eating them.
Hold on. I just saw some of our faces go, what? Our eyes got really big all of a sudden. Angel, go ahead and mute yourself. Let's go back to the text one more time. When we look at paragraphs 2, 4, and 7, we're noticing that people have cuts. Their knuckles are getting swollen. The acid is eating their fingers off. Sometimes they're falling into the vats, they're dying, and their bodies get sent out as food. Hold on. What do you think the impact of Sinclair's writing will be on the reader? I'm gonna put us back into breakout rooms. Please be ready to come back in 90 seconds.
I think that it will make the readers like really disgusted.
Yeah, more cautious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can we say more? Disgusted about what?
Like, they just realized that what they like, they're probably eating people. Like, if they're getting shipped out to other people for them to eat, then they might
keep talking.
Very scared to think that there's a possibility if I fall into a vat, I'll burn alive, which is the most painful thing that can ever happen to a human, and then someone could possibly eat me as lard, like eat the remains of me, and that's disgusting and disturbing.
So I'm hearing you name that the impact on you is that you're like disgusted. What do you think the impact was on the millions of people who might have read his book?
They'd probably be like shocked and even more disturbed. They'd probably be horrified and then angry as well that the I guess factory owners would let this stuff happen. I'd rebel if I were there.
All right, who wants to share? What's the effect on readers? Woo, look at all those hands. Start us off, Ava. Ava, you have to unmute yourself.
My group discussed that, like, after, like, say you just read this and you just read this like journal, and then you're seeing how it says like there might be human remains in the food that you're eating. You're not gonna like think of the workers. You're first gonna think of how like this is disgusting. What am I eating? Like I've been putting this stuff into my body, and now I could be getting sick or like a bunch of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can you call on someone to build?
Okay. So I saw some really excited responses in the chat. I know. There's only 4 more minutes. I know it's such an awesome class to watch. And as we all have gone through the trials and tribulations of virtual instruction, this is awesome. I agree. So I'd love to hear from you guys. Let me go back to our questions if I can get that there. Give me 1 second. So what did you guys notice? How does this exemplify the planning process and best practices? What kind of questions did she ask? Why were they strong questions? Love to hear. Like, I see a lot of like, she really knows her material. She really thought about the questions. The text is a really good choice because kids are really engaged in it. Love to hear some thoughts or share some of the stuff that you already typed in the chat, because I see a lot of awesome things.
I love that she, when they were missing that one element at the end that was going to give them the aha moment, she didn't tell them, she just pointed it out. So they were allowed to make that aha moment on their own and not with her saying, ooh, look, let me tell you what happens here. I thought that was really cool. And were they a lot of hand motions happening? Like, I don't know, they were all doing a lot of the same hand motions. So I don't know if that was part of the classroom culture, and the idea of also, like when she said, keep talking, you know, encouraging the student to keep going, you're getting there. And that's a good way without having to ask them another question. Because eventually I think they will get there if you just keep letting them, you know, keep talking.
Yeah, so I think there's two things that you pulled out there that, so yes, she clearly has some strong procedures, expectations, routines in her classroom that is carrying over even in a virtual environment. And we know that the engagement piece and the culture piece can suffer sometimes in a virtual environment. But also, like you said, when students weren't getting that piece that would give them that aha moment, she didn't tell them. But that means that she also knew what she wanted them to get at, right? Like thinking about that exemplar student response. She knew what she wanted them to notice.
Well,
sorry? Okay. She knew what she wanted them to notice. So she had kind of that planned and scaffolded. Love to hear some other, the number of hands raised. Totally. Really high engagement. Love to hear what else you guys pulled out about what really exemplified the planning process and best practices for what we talked about today.
I think too, part of what engaged them based off how she introduced this session was, this is something they had worked on already. So they had already read this text like the day before, and their responses, she felt like they had missed some pieces. And kind of like Alicia was saying, she didn't say what piece they sort of missed, but clearly they had to go back and do a close read of this text. And so they were to come up with a different interpretation than they talked about and discussed the day before. So again, you know, I think that speaks to both the text being difficult and that they need, you know, having to do a second read, and the kids recognizing that as they worked through it again together, that they really did miss some really gross stuff that's pretty fascinating clearly to them. And I loved how she did a lot of, like, we used to call it accountable talk, the tell me more, and can you add to that? She was doing a lot of just, you know, good student interaction, like encouraging, can you say that again? Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking? So she didn't accept their first response, even in their second day's read.
Yeah, using the strategy of close reading, which we've talked about, is really important with complex text. So yeah, she did a really good job. I see that someone wrote about how they love the interactive highlighting. So it really kept everyone engaged. Anything else that stood out? I mean, I know that a lot of people were really excited. Anything else that she did? Like when you think about that process that we went through, right? She definitely read the text. She definitely thought about the complexity of it. Definitely thought about what questions she needed to ask to get at the complexity, and also started to think about the student responses. So she knew what she wanted students to answer and planned her questions and her scaffolds appropriately to get them there. Anything else that really stood out to you guys?
I know someone had said that that transition of, you know, showing them the text again so that they could determine the answer for themselves. But I love how it was a student, again, like in particular, because we know she didn't give the answer, but a student came back and was like, I respectfully disagree, you know, and it was like, they are eating people. And that's when everyone was like, what? Like just you know, the looks of like shock and horror. And I love that it came from a student. And again, you know, it was within that dialogue, and it was just a safe, open space for discussion too. And I love that. You know, you didn't see cameras turned off, or, you know, a lack of engagement, or foreheads and up. Like, I mean, I feel like I see that all day long. And so like, these kids were really engaged. And I think that has to do more with perhaps how she structures her class, you know, and how she's created that classroom culture, in addition to just the interesting text itself. So yeah, I really appreciated that. I thought that was really cool.
Ellie, did you want to share too? I know you started talking at the same time.
Her answer was a lot cooler than mine, but I did. I thought it was really evident that not only did she anticipate what she wanted her students to say, it was also evident that she had planned the questions that she asked based on her knowledge of her students. Like, you could tell she knew them, she knew the conversation they were going to have, and she knew the questions that she needed to ask next to get them to the place of understanding where they needed to be.
Yeah, awesome. Any last thoughts about this great video?
I feel like too, she repeated the questions, like the one where she was talking about coming up with different interpretations. Instead of saying, you all haven't close read, going back to that culture of learning, instead of like shaming them with that statement, which is real tempting, you know, you all haven't close read, she turned the question around to being a little bit more accessible. Like, what effect does this have on the reader? You know, to then get them to go back to the text, which essentially, you know, is thinking about those different interpretations, to share that out again. It's the same question. She just asked it in a way that felt a little bit less, you know, it was less risky in the way that she phrased it.
I love how so many people in this discussion have commented on the culture of learning, right? That's not something that we've dived into at all or talked about, but we see the impact it has when you have a strong culture of learning, right? It totally impacts everything from student engagement to student responses to just what you can accomplish in a class period. So awesome. I love how we hit on all of those things. Well, now I know we could talk about this for hours. This is such an awesome video. But now I want us to think about doing this for our own students, doing that process. How can we get to something that looks like what we just saw, thinking about the process we went through today and then the knowledge we gained. So we're going to now talk about what this actually looks like in our own school, in our own buildings, in our own districts. So what we're going to do now, and we actually have enough time today, which I'm super excited about, guys. We're going to go into breakout rooms, and there's going to be breakout rooms with teachers by school, by district, and then also a larger breakout room for school leaders. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the following process. So for teachers, you will identify the complexity of the text that you're looking at together, analyze the questions together, tweak the questions or supplement as needed, and craft an exemplar response. The entire process that we went through together today, but using a text from your own curriculum. Leaders will think about what this actually means when they're going into classrooms. So when you're observing a lesson with a complex text, what would you expect to see from teachers, from the teacher and from students? And based on what trends you're seeing in your school or in your district, what support might be needed for teachers when you go back to the building? And then you'll think about kind of like what your focus will be when you go back to the building after you've gone through this process. What might change or what might you refocus on after going through this process? So John is going to put us into breakout rooms. We're going to be in breakout rooms for about 22 minutes. So John, you can bring us back at 22 minutes after the hour. And we are going to, once again, type in a Google Doc, which we will drop in the chat. And so you're going to have to pick one person from each group to type. And any questions before we hop in?
Just to clarify, Lindsay, now they're going to be using their own materials, thinking about an upcoming lesson that they're about to teach. And that'll be the focus of the next 20 some minutes.
Exactly. Whatever text, common text you guys chose to bring, You're going to go through that same process that we went through all together using your materials. And leaders will think more broadly about what you would hope to see, what you know about those in your district or building, and what you might want to bring back to support them in a way that they can do this really effectively.
And we realize that some of you are from smaller schools. Like when I taught, I was 6th grade ELA. Like I didn't have a peer. So you can still have some rich discussion, even if you don't have somebody that's teaching the same grade as you or who's going to be teaching the exact same text as you. But where possible, if you're from a larger school, if you could choose a text that several of you might all be teaching in the future, that would make the experience even richer.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bethany. So John, whenever you're ready, you can put us all into breakout rooms and we'll come back together in about 20 plus minutes. You hear about, after you went through that process, what are you thinking that your focus will be when you go back to your building? What are you going to be looking for? What are you going to be making sure you do in planning for lessons? Love to hear from a few people about how you're thinking about shifting your focus when you go back into your building or your computer or whatever it may be.
And Lindsay, is it okay to think small here? Like I might say, I want to try my hand at crafting some exemplar responses and see how that helps me in the moment, whatever, something.
Yes, but bite size, right? Something manageable.
What's something you could do by next Tuesday? Like just a couple days out. Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to oversimplify this, but I do think there's something to be said in terms of taking the chunks of text. If you're not given the whole, like pages to read, like to just actually read the chunks of text that are coming up for next week and maybe work through a couple of questions to direct yourself back to the text to kind of see what comes up as you go through that process.
Yeah, we talked about kind of like putting on your student hat, right?
Yeah.
And thinking about what the student will experience and crafting questions or thinking about things that way. What else might you guys think about doing, whether you're a teacher or leader?
Oh, we actually talked a little about looking at the end of unit task and just being very aware of how those questions throughout the unit and Amplify lead up to that. And so keeping that in mind, what knowledge students are building and what they're going to be required to do at the end of the unit and how those questions are supporting that. And even maybe just posting that and making students aware of it as well. And then thinking through some of those exemplar responses.
Well, the good news is in February, we'll be able to come back together and share what our focus was, what we did, and kind of how it all played out. So what we're going to be hoping to do in the next months before we come back together, this is also in your notes, so you don't have to write it down or memorize. But for teachers, I want you to just teach the lesson that you just worked on, or if it's something you already taught, an upcoming text, and answer these questions and come back to the group and share. How did the complexity of the text help you determine where to scaffold the questions for your students? Did the task and the questions set your students up for success? And did you see a change in student engagement or responses based on the process that you went through planning? So similar to the process we went through today. And for leaders, I would love for you to have an opportunity to get into 1 or 2 classrooms and think about, did the teacher attend to those qualitative complexity of the text, and how do you know that? Where did you see evidence of the core action 1 and 2 that we really spoke about today? And did students unlock the meaning of the text based on what the teachers did? And how do you know that? And then when we come back in February, we'll be able to discuss how this process affected us as teachers, affected what we saw as leaders, and also ultimately affected students' engagement and students' understanding of these complex texts. So we're going to just quickly talk about some action items that we have, and you guys now know your next steps, and we will give some information over the next week or so about the specifics for our February meeting. But as you're going through this process, any questions that come up, any thoughts you have, feel free to reach out to Bethany and she can connect you with me or someone else on my team or one of the coaches so we can walk you through this process, because it may feel different or more questions may come up when you're actually doing it in your own buildings or districts. So I'm going to kick it off to Bethany. Thank you guys again. This is awesome. And Bethany, you're up.
I'm going to trust you to multitask, even though we know we can't technically do that. But just because I know if you're like me, there's kids outside the door, people want supper, that kind of thing. So I've dropped a survey real quick, like less than 2 minutes, a link in the chat if you don't care to open that and check that out. And it's anonymous. There's no way we can tell. So please be honest, right? In terms of your action items, yes, please complete the tasks or reflections outlined for your role. That's just what Lindsay talked about. And I might even suggest, so it's called a learning cycle, which means we're going to get into this kind of cyclical approach. I would even suggest maybe get a notebook or something that can be your Strong Start Network place that you put your stuff, right? Because we would love for you to really reflect. I mean, actually take some notes, write down, gather some student work samples, bring your questions. If you tweaked them, write them out, come back and be able to actually dig into some real rich conversation, just like we want our students to do, be able to dig into some really rich conversation about what you tried, what worked, more importantly, what didn't work, so that we can all really learn from that. And so we can really start to kind of gather some real learning as a network. This will be really what fuels the work of the network as we move forward. So it's really important that you get yourself a little system for how you're going to engage in the learning that you do back in your classrooms and in your schools if you're a leader. Also, like I said before, send your network MOU if you've not done that. Get that to Brittany, and ideally before the end of the week. And then also don't forget your network member picture. Remember our little network glamour shots, as I kind of teased in my email that went out. I think we have most of them in, but if you've not sent your picture, please send that in. And Brittany is building out our member page on our website. So we'll be able to really see each other and how we kind of make up in teams. Also, network dates, you see that on the right, the 17th, that's our next Zoom reflection call. And so stay tuned, more information will be coming out about that. It'll be included on the website since that's our hub of information. And of course, Brittany will send out some additional reminders about that via email. All righty, I'll zip it. I kept you over 1 minute there, but thank you for doing the survey, and we'll hang around if anybody has any questions about anything. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks, everybody.
I'm going to repost underneath your link here the information for those Amplify folks again that Kara posted earlier,
cool.
Just so people can find that.
Thank you all for sharing. All righty, anybody have any last minute questions? If not, we can all hop off.
Thanks everyone so much. That was awesome.
Bye everybody. Reach out with any questions.
Yes. Bye.